Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги. Давайте мы начнем наш круглый стол. Я представлюсь, моя фамилия Максименко Юрий Леонидович. Я в данном случае заменяю Олега Плужникова, который вынужден был отбыть в служебную командировку в это время. Конкретно я работаю в компании «Базовый элемент», в Российском союзе промышленных предпринимателей. Я являюсь заместителем председателя комитета по экологической, промышленной и технологической безопасности. То есть у меня как бы две такие функции, одна в бизнесе, другая в общественной организации. И мы как бы очень много и конкретно обсуждаем проблем, связанных с окружающей средой, и в частности вот с проблемами, связанными с потеплением климата. Да? И мы, конечно, с воодушевлением приняли возможность проведения такой конференции в нашей стране. И всех приветствуем в Москве. Я думаю, иностранным нашим коллегам, если не удалось, то удастся посмотреть наш чудесный город хоть каким-то образом, да, у нас есть что посмотреть. Ну а в рамках нашей конференции мы хотим обсудить эти проблемы и насколько готова промышленность сегодня к тем возможным изменениям, которые нас ожидают в ближайшие годы, как предполагают научные круги, деловые круги и политики. Ну, должен сказать, что в нашей стране эта проблема еще не приобрела, на наш взгляд, нужного масштаба, так сказать, ее обсуждения этой проблемы. И бизнес как-то на сегодня достаточно настороженным, как мне кажется, относится к этим возможным изменениям. Хотя такие первые признаки, что это действительно имеет место быть и начинает происходить, они имеются. И, конечно, вот это обсуждение на сегодняшней конференции в рамках нашего круглого стола дает возможность обменяться мнениями по поводу действительного и возможного, что может произойти, а что уже происходит, и как к этому, собственно, готовиться. Конечно, нам бы хотелось больше, нам, российским людям, понять, насколько наша промышленность внимательно относится к этой проблеме и готова в какой-то степени к ее решению, и насколько мировое сообщество уверено в том, что те данные научные, которые мы располагаем, они отвечают действительности. И насколько можно надеяться на те прогнозные оценки, которые сегодня даются учеными. Но последние годы мы все наблюдаем, и особенно вот жители Москвы, наблюдали два последних очень жарких лета, которые исключительно неблагоприятно воздействовали на здоровье населения. И прошлогодний 2010 года 50-дневный период засухи, буквально такой жары, привел к неприятным последствиям распространения продуктов сгорания и торфяных залежей, и лесов. В общем-то, мы, конечно, испытывали на себе возможные последствия происходящих изменений. Но одно дело пережить 1-2 лета, а другое дело, значит, иметь возможность уже подготовиться каким-то образом к тем возможным последствиям, которые мы ожидаем. Поэтому с нашей стороны это очень важное мероприятие, которое мы сегодня с вами посещаем. И надеемся, что разговор получится серьезный и интересный. Ну, а для начала я предоставлю слово моему коллеге, господину Уолтерсу, который представит себя и сделает несколько замечаний.
Thank you, Yuri. Thank you for inviting me to join your panel and your discussion. Just as a brief introduction, my name is Walter Fust. I am one of those species who had been working in managerial positions in the government, in the private sector, and in civil society. I say this because we all applaud the private-public partnership approach, but very often we have difficulties to understand what the particular language or the particular behavior pattern in those different areas are. politicians, they obviously want to get re-elected. Business understands profit risks and has to survive. And civil society, of course, want to see the accountability side and want to see the benefits for them in their livelihood. So when it comes to climate change, we obviously also speak about mitigation and adaptation. Today we particularly speak about adaptation, and obviously the foresight and analysis what to do from the different partners to complement each other in reaching results and not just in being active. We have to go for results. Needs that we understand those different point of views. Because only when we understand and respect the different point of views, then we can come to a kind of a round table to discuss those issues and to find common decisions, common policies. Very often in politics or in business, we do not know exactly what science can contribute. And that is why very often scientists start to work, let's say, in isolation. But when it comes to adaptation to climate change, we really need to bring all those protagonists, all those who can contribute to that very round table in order to find the right policies, in order to set the right legal framework. But to have good legal frameworks is one thing. If it is not adapted, if it is not implemented, if there are no sanctions in it, normally it does not go very far. Many countries have a so-called national adaptation plan. Many others still do not have that. Many people think business is not doing enough without knowing what really business is doing. So we also have these different poles, the global commons, what people understand and they are concerned about, and then the particular need of the various industrial sectors. And to bring that to a certain level of common understanding is, of course, also quite an issue. And I'm sure you will hear from various specialists around this table how it could best be done. And let's not forget progress monitoring is important. Otherwise, we are turning a wheel. And I have heard in the last 20 years so many politicians saying, we need action, and even World Bank presidents carrying a label on their T-shirt, we need action. I told Jim Wolfensohn, I agree we need action, but we need results. It is about results, and it is results that drives us further, and that can hold us accountable. And at the end, in a present world with a lot of people getting media competence in social media, the whole space and place concept is anyway going to change, and we will have a complete new set and challenges for companies in doing their marketing work. So communication probably is half of the price of it. Now, before I hand over to the moderator of the panel, I would just like to ask you whether you could, by raising your hand, indicate from what sector you are. Who is from the government sector? Who is from the private sector? Who is from civil society? And who is from science? So we have here a strong majority of people with scientific background coming from science. We have, let's say, a rather sharp minority when it comes to the private sector, but nevertheless, we will certainly have the opportunity to exchange among those different sectors, also when it comes to the question and answer period. Thank you. I give over to the moderator.
Thank you, Mr. Fust. Hello, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to moderate this session. My name is Wijnald de Wit. I'm going to break with tradition. I'm actually going to stand up and descend, because I think that this podium, obviously, it kind of breaks the room, and we're actually here for a round table. And I feel a lot of the experts on the podium, but there's also a lot of the experts in the audience. So I also want to make sure that you, as the audience, have the opportunity to contribute to this round table. Very quickly about myself, I'm a partner with an advisory firm. The advisory firm is called Dalberg Global Development Advisors. We work on development issues across a number of areas: global health, access to finance, agriculture, energy and environment. And what we see is a lot of the ways of dealing with the issues, the development issues that you see in global health, agriculture, I mean, can be replicated to those other areas. Some examples that we have seen is we've worked on the Pledge Guarantee for Health, which basically allows developing country governments to make purchases of health commodities with using the balance sheet of the Gates Foundation as collateral, or the agricultural pool mechanism, which we're actually working on right now, which stimulates innovation in agriculture, which actually deals with adaptation as well. Or finally, the Affordable Medicines Facility for Malaria, which is basically a advanced market commitment to incentivize private sector pharmaceutical manufacturers to invest in manufacturing artemisinin and combined therapies, the only proven, at the moment in any way, medicine to malaria. So my role, as I already mentioned, I'm going to moderate this session, so which basically means that I'm going to manage the process and make sure that we stay on target, and I'll make sure that what we can report back tomorrow with the wider group is insightful and innovative. I mean, from the past few days, actually the past day, it became abundantly clear that everybody agrees that there is a big role, there's a large role for the private sector in addressing adaptation issues. The question is how to best do that. And we have a number of people here who will share their perspectives on how to best do that. And we obviously also want to hear from you. To solve, I mean, to run the discussion today and to solve that question on how to best do that, we will discuss, first of all, obviously we need to define the challenges that we are actually up against, and then we'll discuss the types of solutions, best practices, good practices that we have seen that can work particularly well in overcoming those challenges, in that sense, sharing the knowledge. The session will have the roundtable will have two sections. One section is for the panel members to introduce themselves. They will take 5 minutes and they will share their perspectives on state and business interaction on climate change, on addressing adaptation issues. And then the second part is really around questions. And I have some questions, and I'm sure that you have some questions, and I'm sure that the panel members, the presentations of the panel members will raise some questions. So I ask you to write those down, so we will have opportunity to go through. All right. With that, I would like to invite the first speaker, Ms. Mary Power.
It's on.
Sorry, just testing. Yes, firstly, to introduce myself, my name is Mary Power. I'm Director for Resource Mobilization and Strategic Partnerships with the World Meteorological Organization. And of course, a big element of partnership is working with the private sector in the area of better delivery of weather and climate services. So my role here is to briefly outline some of the challenges we see facing us in terms of building strong partnerships between state and private sector in our efforts to address the issue of climate change adaptation. Basically, I think, as my colleague said, it's been well stated many times during the last few days that there is a widespread recognition now that there is a very strong and critical role for the private sector in terms of assisting government and communities to adapt to climate variability and climate change. In fact, it's now seen to some extent that private sector investment is extremely critical and that without it, our efforts will not succeed. This has been recognized within the wider UN system through the establishment of a mechanism called the UN Global Compact on climate change, which brings global business leaders together with the broader UN for dialogue and discussion on how industry is going to adapt to the challenges ahead. The challenges are fairly widespread. Currently, there's generally a low sense of awareness or a sense of urgency within the private sector, particularly related to the indirect risks of climate change rather than just the direct impacts on their business. Because of this, there's still a somewhat limited willingness or appetite to engage, particularly amongst key decision makers in business. One of the challenges we see is that in risk management and also in climate risk management, business generally really focuses on the business continuity model rather than necessarily looking at the value chain. So the focus is really on business resilience, which is quite a narrow focus. What seems to be lacking, I guess, is a broader understanding of the more indirect impacts on the business sector and the impact on society as a whole, and the need for business to have stable social and economic conditions in which to operate. So in that sense, enterprise risk management systems still tend to be very narrow and do not integrate climate change adaptation. Just as an example, I think the recent floods in Thailand really demonstrate the broader impact on the business environment, not necessarily saying that the floods themselves were due to climate change, but certainly as a major climatic event. In Thailand, following the floods, disruptions to business continuity in the transport sector affected the supply chain across the board in the whole retail sector, so that basically supermarkets, food supplies, other essential services were actually not able to restock, causing quite significant problems within the city. The country's important role as a major manufacturing hub for industries such as automotives and electronics has already extended its impact to the North American supply chain and also throughout Southeast Asia. The additional impact on global companies operating within Thailand has forced some companies already to shift their production lines out of the country to neighboring countries. Obviously, if they don't return when the situation has been rectified, then clearly there's a significant loss of jobs and livelihoods and further impact on local communities and the economy of the country. So I give that as a case study in terms of needing a much wider focus in terms of risk management in relation to climate change adaptation. Another area where the short-term business planning model can lead to potential risk is also in the area of maladaptation, where climate change adaptation actions taken, I guess, in a shorter-term perspective of perhaps 10 to 15 years could actually be wrong or ineffective and might exacerbate in the future the real impacts of climate change on the business environment. Clearly, I think what would be relevant to everyone here, and particularly to the science and research community, is the challenge of translating the information we have on climate change scenarios and likely impacts into, I guess, a usable information system for business leaders and key decision makers in government. Clearly, we need scaling up of information so that the information is is locally relevant, both geographically and in a cultural context, and is delivered to decision makers in a manner that they can actually understand and utilize this information in the decision-making process. So we need to be both geographically tailored and also thematically and sector-specific in how we present these scenarios to the business sector. Clearly, the degree of uncertainty expressed in our models also causes some caution and discomfort in the business sector in terms of taking significant investment decisions, looking at, I guess, the 10 to 50-year outlook. So again, I think translating what we mean by this uncertainty into a comprehensible model for business to work with is quite a critical challenge. Generally, these issues I've outlined means that it's still a significant challenge to incentivize business to invest in climate change adaptation, not just, I guess, for business continuity, but generally for the benefit of government and society as a whole. With that, I'll pass back to the moderator to hand over the discussion. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Ms. Power. I think that that sets out quite clearly what the incentive is for businesses to manage their risks. I think what the next speaker will show, Mr. Kivisari, is that obviously adaptation, on the one hand, it is a risk to business, as we've seen in Thailand, but on the other hand, there's actually opportunities that emerge from adaptation, which Mr. Kivisari will speak to.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I come from the Federation of Finnish Financial Services. We are a lobby organization for the insurers and banks also. So I represent the insurance side of the issue. This morning, I heard from the presentation of Mr. Eduardo Calvo. On one of his slides, he said that commercial insurance model is doomed, and maybe my role here is to present other evidence. Well, commercial insurance is all about risk sharing in a certain setting. That is one of my theses here. And the second is that you need good and well-regulated public-private partnership to benefit from this risk sharing. So what I mean by risk sharing is that we have, in all situations, we have risk sharing. Partly it's done by the state, partly it's done by the social partners. Then commercial insurance is one part of risk sharing, and it works in certain situations. I do not counter Mr. Calvo on his analysis, but I just want to say that in situations where commercial insurance is functioning, it can play a very good role, especially in adaptation, where pricing the risks means that people and companies will find it easier to understand what risks to avoid, how to develop their operations, their behavior in such a way that they can adapt to changing climate, changing conditions, and pricing these risks is really a good incentive to make people behave differently. But also in this area, it must be understood that private insurance is, it needs to be profitable. It needs to be profit-driven. Therefore, not everything that happens in the form of insurance is always good. Instead, you need this public-private partnership setting where the rules are clear and stable as they can be in this ever-changing world. But there you need clear rules to have a role for the public sector, to have a role for the private sector, to fulfill their functions, their roles in a way that is beneficial to the society. with these rules, I mean, there needs to be good regulation on how things operate, and secondly, there needs to be good settings so that the state doesn't intervene into issues that are better dealt with with the private model of insurance. In that way, both sectors can fulfill their roles. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Kivisaar. I think this is an excellent segue to Mr. Fust, who is going to share his perspectives on managing and governing those risks that are between public and private, so the gray area. Mr. Fust?
Thank you. Yes, it's of course a question, what are the so-called insurable risks and what are out of interest or range to be insured. But when I asked one of the big reinsurance companies, Swiss Re, how many governments do have a chief risk officer they are dealing with, they told me not many. So I continued my study, and it is incredible worldwide. There are not a dozen countries having in the Prime Minister's office or in the President's office a chief risk officer who is, let's say, the head of a risk governance unit. Obviously, to assess the risk is one thing, to manage it another, but to govern the whole risk scenario is something we miss still in most of the countries. Now, what is risk governance? It is a tool and a process in one. But when you assess the risk, it's wonderful and that people know what the risks are. But then people obviously want to know, what are we going to do with those risks? Do we insure the right risks? Are they insurable or not? How can we reduce, mitigate the risk? How can we deal with those situations? And in many countries there will be the need, that is my forecast, that you set up kind of national risk governance roundtables, as it is important to set up such kind of roundtables to discuss the research agenda. Because many things can be changed from likelihood to more evidence when research and research institutions are involved, and when governments or private sector partners are not just circling around. When I asked the CEO of BP why was it possible what happened in the Gulf of Mexico, he said to me, we had an amazing risk system, analyzing system, but we were fragmentizing the risks in such a way that nobody was anymore responsible for the overall risk governance. And that is exactly what was discussed also in January at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where they have the so-called risk governance group, where different partners from private, public sectors sit together and look into the risk chains and where are the weak points in those chains and how those weak points can be addressed from a management point of view to not make that part weaker but stronger. So obviously we have to address also in international organizations and for us, and I was happy to listen this morning just in the room next to it, the representative of a UN entity talking about risk governance. I was very glad that Madame Albrito mentioned that very clearly, but it should not always be related to disasters. That is the consequence at the end if you don't do the risk governance well. So risk governance should immediately come after assessing the risk. And you can turn risks into opportunities, and opportunities are part of the risk government side. So don't forget, please, risk governance is an issue, and risk assessment is not just the end of the chain. Thank you.
All right, I think that will stay with us. Can I now invite Mr. Konyaev to share his experiences at Gazprom?
Да, спасибо уважаемым коллегам. Они уже отчасти ответили на те, или, скажем так, задали тон тем вопросам, которые, собственно говоря, существуют у бизнеса. Но я бы, единственное, хотел бы сразу сказать, что «Газпром» — это далеко не весь бизнес России, и отчасти, может быть, я буду говорить ближе к тем проблемам и тем вопросам, которые свойственны именно и актуальны для нашей компании. И в первую очередь я бы, хотел бы остановиться на том изменении климата и, скажем так, вопросам, связанным с этим, с прогнозом вообще этого процесса, актуальным для наших северных территорий. Территория Арктики, это является перспективой как для нашей страны и для «Газпрома» в частности, с точки зрения, скажем так, освоения и получения определенных природных ресурсов и поставок их. Этот регион является наиболее, может быть, я так со своей колокольни, с точки зрения нашей компании, является наиболее климатозависимым, и наиболее риски, связанные с изменением климата, на примере данной территории, они наиболее ярко, так сказать, могут быть продемонстрированы. Наша компания, соответственно, ведет работу по освоению природных ресурсов и добыче газа, в первую очередь, как на территории Арктики и как на ее сухопутной части, и в частности мы выходим на территорию полуострова Ямал, уже вышли. А также в перспективе и вот в ближайшие уже идут работы по освоению и по началу освоения шельфовых территорий, находящихся также на арктической территории, но уже в море. Весь этот регион, и сухопутная, и морская часть, в рамках работ по освоению данной территории у нас проводилась и проводится работа по идентификации рисков, связанных с изменением, скажем так, климатических рисков. И отчасти эти риски, они, скажем так, какова доля в общих климатических рисках, доля рисков, связанных с изменением, то есть с процессом изменения климата. Это вот как раз тот, может быть, постановочный вопрос, который я бы хотел в конце моего сообщения, так сказать, обозначить. В частности, можно говорить, или в первую очередь нужно сказать о тех тенденциях температурных, которые влияют в результате изменения температуры, влияют на растепление вечной мерзлоты. И этот процесс, как показывает сегодняшняя ситуация, происходит неравномерно. И прогноз точно так же говорит о том же самом. В результате неравномерного растепления территории происходит, соответственно, неравномерное увеличение нагрузки в данном случае на газотранспортную сеть или на объекты коммуникации, что может привести соответственно, к ситуации, скажем так, аварийной ситуации. Следующий риск, который для нас существенен, это связан с береговой линией. Разработка шельфовых месторождений непосредственно связана с выходом на береговую линию коммуникаций и газопровода в частности. И в данном случае мы наблюдаем изменение береговой линии в связи с и сокращение, скажем так, 2-4 метра в год. И прогнозы, связанные с возможным, так сказать, изменением климата и его потеплением, также приводят к, скажем так, к отступлению данной территории береговой и снижением ее устойчивости. Следующий риск, который хотелось бы обозначить, это связано с нашими непосредственно уже шельфовыми объектами. Он связан с изменением температуры, увеличением ледовых нагрузок и изменением, так сказать, и возможным процессом, связанным с айсбергообразованием и с ледовыми явлениями, выпадением, скажем так, с выпадением вместо снега ледовых масс и, соответственно, утяжелением тех конструкций, которые должны обладать соответствующей несущей способностью. Это связано, в общем-то, с теми как раз перепадами температурными и перепадами температурными изменениями, как раз свойственны вот этим колебаниям, которые возникают в период изменения температуры. Мы, соответственно, а также еще хотелось бы по суше остановиться на одном вопросе, связанном с гидрологическими режимами, которые опять-таки свойственны переходному периоду и увеличением риска высоких паводков или высоких, скажем так, экстремально высоких объемов стока возникающих. Вот. Соответственно, «Газпром», как любая компания, которая выполняет, скажем так, работы на этой территории, закладывает определенную, несет финансовые затраты и на, скажем так, покрытие того риска, который возможен в случае данных экстремальных температурных условий. В частности, те ледовые платформы, которые мы уже, так сказать, запроектировали, и в частности, это проект «Штокман», у нас предполагает судового типа. То есть в случае появления айсберга эта платформа может быть отсоединена от трубопровода и, соответственно, уйти от столкновения. Для наших наземных коммуникаций также проводится ряд мероприятий, связанных с предотвращением растепления вечной мерзлоты. Опоры, на которых находятся наши коммуникации, также определенные проводятся технологические работы, связанные с повышением устойчивости данных объектов. Но в целом хотелось бы сказать, что нам необходим достоверный прогноз для того, чтобы те затраты, которые мы несем на покрытие возможного, скажем так, ледового или климатического последствий климатических изменений и рисков, о которых я уже говорил, чтобы они были адекватны, чтобы они были, скажем так, адекватны тому риску, который теоретически может возникнуть, или по прогнозам, по достоверным, как нам хотелось бы, прогнозам может возникнуть. В связи с этим, основным вопросом, который, скажем так, взаимодействие государства и бизнеса, наш круглый стол, тема нашего круглого стола, это, в общем-то, мы бы хотели видеть, и в целом, более достоверный или, скажем так, максимально достоверный прогноз тех изменений и тех последствий климатических изменений, которые у нас могут возникнуть. А в связи с этим нам бы хотелось, как предложение, мы видим, как одно из решений. Решений может быть много, есть, наверное, и современные спутниковые и так далее наблюдения, но более приземленная это та сеть гидрологическая сеть и, возможно, метеорологическая сеть, которая находится в зоне нашей вновь осваиваемой территории, она, как нам кажется, требует развития. И, скажем так, как следствие, при наличии этой сети, и сам прогноз возникновения тех гидрологических негативных событий в результате может быть повышен. Мы эту работу проводим совместно с администрацией Малоненецкого автономного округа, Проводим эту работу самостоятельно, также самостоятельно, скажем так, как по прогнозу климатических изменений, так и по финансовым, скажем так, по технологическим подготовке технологической, связанной с возможными вот данными изменениями, но хотелось бы, ну, скажем так, еще раз обозначить эту ситуацию и роль государства в части вот данного прогноза хотелось бы видеть на данных вновь осваиваемых территорий более, скажем так, очевидную. Спасибо.
Thank you very much for sharing that. Thank you very much for sharing those practical example from Gazprom and a very exhaustive list of what's happening. I think that's a very good, very good information for the rest of the discussion. Now, can I ask? I mean, we talked a bit about the science part now in the last panel with the last panelist, and we talked about the policy part. I mean, the risk touches the policy part very well. I mean, the final part that we wanted to also touch upon is the practical part. So actually, how does the planning and how does the implementation happen? And this is what Pradeep is going to speak about.
Thanks. My name is Pradeep Kurukulasuri. I work with the United Nations Development Program. And I work for a part of UNDP that supports countries to access finance to address their adaptation needs. So we work with a lot of least developed countries around the world, but also a number of middle-income countries who have undertaken various efforts to identify what it is that they need to implement as urgent priorities. We help them access the finance for it and set up programs which countries then implement themselves, and then we provide support and oversight. In anticipation of this round table, I've been thinking a lot about what really I could say, and I think what my ideas really came when I was preparing to come here. I live in Thailand. I live in Bangkok, and we live in a part of Bangkok which is currently dry, but I don't think it'll be dry when I get back. And the part that struck me about what I was going to say really came when as I was preparing to come here. I went to the supermarket to make sure my kids had food and all that for the time that I was away. And for the first time in my life, I saw notices saying you can only take 3 bottles of milk home with you per customer. You can only take 1 box of eggs with you. You can only take this much of toilet paper or whatever. And I grew up in Sri Lanka where with the war and everything, I can't remember a day when we had these kinds of changes in our life. So clearly there was an issue here. Not only were the local produce not available in the supermarket, but even the imported things couldn't get to the supermarket because the infrastructure was flooded, or factories or warehouses were flooded. So it's quite a big deal and quite a change. And I, of course, my mind was on my trip, so I was thinking, well, how is this really relevant how could I bring this into this discussion? And it struck me that, as UNDP, we help countries get access to public finance. But we all realize that the available public finance that's available, that's necessary to deal with the priorities that are out there are insignificant. They're almost negligible compared to needs. But where is this additional resource going to come from? And yes, part of it would be maintaining an argument that additional and more public finance has to be made available, and that's a valid argument to maintain. But for the kinds of structural transformative changes that are necessary in the context of these emerging risks, it's very clear that the private sector has a major role to play here. And it's not only in terms of making available resources. It's really about effecting a kind of behavioral adjustment, a shift in the way business does business, to make sure that the opportunities, the new opportunities, the products and services are all geared towards these sort of emerging realities. And then, so I started thinking about, well, what really then is preventing that? And a lot of the speakers touched on some of the aspects that are important. But I think before the discussion even gets to that point, it's really important to unpack what we mean by the private sector. Because the private sector is a lot of things, and each of these things that forms the private sector will require different solutions. We talk about the private sector. If I say this to my wife or my friends, they will immediately start thinking corporate social responsibility. Or you want Nokia to give you money so you can go and plant trees somewhere. So, well, that may be part of it, but there's a whole lot of other things that the private sector does. There's the whole area of products and services, the development of products and services, which may be more geared towards the emerging climates, the provision of drought-tolerant seeds, the R&D that goes into it, the technologies that can play a role, etc., etc. Then there is the whole area of finance, insurance, credit lines, and whatnot, equity, etc. Which also is private sector. We know that, for example, microfinance is largely private sector. In some cases it's state banks, but in other cases it's the private banks getting into the provision of microfinance. And then there's a whole area of new and emerging opportunities. Every challenge, somebody said, also is an opportunity. And that my friend from UNDP reminded me about that the other day. And we know that private sector entities in different parts of the world do embrace these kinds of opportunities. In Zimbabwe, we're supporting an initiative to develop businesses in areas that no longer cannot grow crops. And they've diversified into different types of businesses, beekeeping, crocodile farming, with a tourism enterprise. So these kinds of entities, activities that create new opportunities also exist, and many places these things are sprouting up. It's not emerging as much and fast and as we would like to see, because there are various barriers. And then the final area, of course, is in value chain, in securing value chains, making sure that the location of the suppliers is not in areas that's conducive to flooding. If you were in New York and you were looking for Nokia lenses, for example, or Western Digital hard drives, you'll probably not find them, because 20% of the global supply is underwater in Thailand. So these kinds of issues are very, very important, and I think unless we start making the effort to unpack these, and I must also say, engage the private sector actively. I mean, the fact that there aren't too many in here is an indication that we need to do more, and ensure that they are fully part of this process. Because how public finance, the very scarce available finance, how that can help to facilitate this is to really act as a means to catalyze the kind of involvement that we want to see. So helping to remove the kinds of barriers that's preventing private entities to come into the market, creating the conditions. Those are the ways in which government can support much more involvement in private sector activity in this space, and we hope that through the work that UNDP is supporting, and certainly our partners around the world are doing, that hopefully very soon we will have some concrete ideas to move this forward. The discussion so far has really been about public finance, and now that tide is changing and more needs to be done. So if anybody is interested in research and contributing to this, and this is certainly an area that we ought to be looking at more.
All right, thank you. This concludes the first part of the session. Second part really is to open it up for questions. And while you are thinking of your question, please don't hesitate to ask them in English or Russian, of course. I wanted to take the opportunity to unpack, to stay in Pradeep's terminology, some of the things that we've heard today by asking a very simple question. I mean, if we were to prioritize, what are the three main things that the private sector has to do in order to engage the public sector? I mean, what does engage mean? And vice versa. So what does the public sector need to do to engage the private sector? What are the three things? And if we have a quick discussion on that, we can see if we can dive into, okay, so what are these three things and what are examples of where these things have gone particularly well, which we can replicate. And I'll ask the question to the panel members, but I'll also ask the question to the audience, because I realize there's a lot of experts in the audience and I want to make sure I have the opportunity as well to contribute. Who would like to take a stab at the three things that the public sector could do to engage the private sector, and the three things that the private sector can do to engage the public sector?
Maybe I can just start. I mean, I'll mention one thing. Certainly one area that's I find lacking is language. There are two different discussions and too many languages being used in this space. We need to start converting words like, climate data, climate scenarios, etc., into language that the private sector understands. What does it mean in terms of the costs and benefits of these actions? Where are the opportunities? Where's the value of these interventions? And there's far too little research that's taking place into understanding the economics of all of this. A lot of the discussion so far that has been taking place is at a very macro level. And it serves a purpose, like Shardul mentioned this morning. It's important for advocacy to put the issue on the agenda. But when we talk about adaptation, these are very local, very specific activities that have to take place. And unless we start looking at that unit of observation, the district level, the subsectoral level analysis to understand better the economics and the value of these interventions and benefits and costs and so on, we'll continue to lose people in the discussion because they just cannot understand it.
All right. Mr. Kivizai?
Yes, you asked for three prerequisites.
Pradeep gave me one, so.
But I have three. Okay, one is really to honor the rule of law, to have a good legal system. The second is to combat corruption. The third is to regulate well the areas where you are working. Mr. Kurukulatsuri mentioned microfinance. I think it's a good example of where you need all these things. We have good examples of microfinance. We have bad examples of microfinance. And without a good environment, you cannot really generate a good and a working system.
All right, thank you. Other views from the panel or from the audience? Nope. Please, Mr. Fust.
Thank you. In my country, we actually did that exercise. And the three requests from the private sector were quite clear. First, we need a long-term policy. We want to know what the government intends. And we need a legal framework which gives us the security to do the adequate investments. The second was a round table with the scientific community to set the national research agenda for the next 10 to 15 years. And the third one was a request to the state to invest more in education, in a broader sense, at all levels, just to get and to increase awareness.
All right, thank you very much. There's all good points of what the public sector can do to engage the private sector. I mean, I'll also take comments on what the private or what the public sector can do to engage the private sector, but also like to hear from what the private sector could do to engage the public sector. Who has a perspective on that?
Можно я предположу, что государство может внимательнее отнестись к конкретным случаям того, что уже потепление климата влияет на хозяйственную деятельность. Вот мой коллега из «Газпрома» почему-то не упомянул конкретные случаи, которые они имели. Он нам, может, об этом больше расскажет. Что происходит с белыми медведями в Арктике? Они пошли на сушу. И это создало другие условия для ведения бизнеса. И обсуждение этих проблем, в том числе и с государственными структурами, может подвести к тому, что действительно нужно менять законодательство в тех вещах, где уже имеются конкретные проявления воздействия на хозяйственную деятельность. И, конечно, если таких примеров уже много будет, в нашей стране как бы еще очень мало обсуждаются эти проблемы. И, естественно, не только бизнес-сообщество, но и политики не очень-то пока озабочены этой проблемой. Но обсуждение конкретных кейс-стадий, как вы говорите, так сказать, они могли бы показать, что проблема-то вот она уже сегодня. Ну, Сергей, может, вы добавите что-нибудь?
Я согласен, что вообще у нас в стране, во-первых, отношение к самому вот этому процессу изменения температуры, я даже не знаю, как его охарактеризовать, оно больше положительное или отрицательное, ну, как к самому этому, как к самой перспективе. Потому что существуют разные точки зрения, что в целом для страны, выгодно ли это, да? Вот. Но есть локальные проблемы, ну, в частности, те, о которых я говорил, также существуют проблемы средние, наоборот, южных широт, где происходит опустынивание в силу там определенных, ну, изменений температурных и влажности. Вот. И, наверное, вот Юрий Леонидович сказал правильно, что надо смотреть частные, так сказать, какие-то примеры. И вот на этих частных примерах, если говорить о нашей стране, ну, я более глобально не хотел бы сейчас высказываться, вот, более предметно эти задачи смотреть, так сказать, где-то то поле совместной деятельности бизнеса и государства, чем государство может помочь бизнесу, ну, в частности, вот я говорю в части прогнозов, там, тех процессов, которые, ну, для того, чтобы закладывать соответствующие финансы и технические мероприятия. Вот. Или, возможно, даже в ряде случаев это необходима какая-то определенная налоговая, так сказать, ну, опять-таки, рассмотрение налоговых изменений в части там, освоения тех или иных территорий, связанных, ну, как раз подверженных тем климатическим рискам и сложность работы именно в тех условиях. Вот. Поэтому, наверное, плясать вот от частного можно в данном случае, ну, хотя глобальная конференция, и, наверное, коллеги могут добавить что-то, так сказать, и сверху можно также смотреть на нее. Вот. Но когда мы смотрим сверху, всегда мы иногда предмет вот точки взаимодействия найти будет, ну, возможно и удастся, но когда мы говорим о частных случаях, это как-то вот, ну, скажем так, понятней бизнесу и понятней, кто именно от лица бизнеса та сторона, которая с государством должна, ну, общаться и свои какие-то находить общие точки взаимоотношений.
All right, thank you. I mean, to me, that sounds like, I mean, there's a joint responsibility between the private sector and the public sector to engage on the risk management part. So identifying, okay, so what are the changes and how does this pose a risk to the company and how does this pose a risk to society at large. So we've heard from Mr. Fust on a way, Switzerland as an example on how public and private sector have engaged. I'd like to bring in what Pradeep was saying earlier about unpacking the private sector and perhaps I mean, if I can direct this question to you, Mr. Foust, can you share a little bit more on how this engagement between public and private on these issues has worked out particularly well?
First, there is a kind of thinking that business is lacking behind. That's not true. Business is far ahead of politics. And it goes even further ahead when there is public pressure and public understanding, when there are educated citizens who, let's say, want to know what is going on. So the process went that way, and of course the issue was then what can be regulated by law and what can be better done by policies of incentives. That can be tax reduction for those who do more, but it can also be a kind of transfer of cost, revenues and others. But again, it is a thorny process to come to those consensus. We sometimes make kind of jokes about our federalism, and a rather jokeful definition would be everybody knows what to do, or everybody is doing what he wants, nobody is doing what he should, but everybody is participating. And as long as people are participating around the table, they talk to each other, they recognize what the government needs, what the private sector needs, what the civil society needs. As long as these dialogues are going on, I think then you can reach results. But let me also clear one thing. This mentality of corporate social responsibility is important, but it is very often wrongly understood. The private sector cannot be the cash cow for what either international institutions do not have or for what governments would like to have. Governments are accountable to people. And at the end, I agree that there are species like the polar bears suffering from climate change, but at the end, it's about people. And when I ask the IPCC how much studies, how much research on climate change has been done relating to the impact for people, I said, little social studies have been done so far. So let's not forget, it's also about people, because nature has no consciousness, nature will adapt, but people have difficulties to adapt.
All right, thank you. I think I've struck the right question, because I think that as 3 panel members actually want to respond to this, and also feel free to dive further on, the 3 things that the private sector could do to engage the public sector and vice versa. I just wanted to check whether or not there is any questions from the audience. I'll come and hand you the mic.
Я представляю общественную организацию из Узбекистана «Эколандшафт» Кадыров Анвар. Вот здесь вот в последнем выступлении особенно прозвучал такой нюанс. Вы сказали, вот политики, то есть государство, тут же сказано было о частном секторе, о бизнесменах, да, и тут же сказано, что общество должно каким-то образом управлять. Вот здесь как раз вот тот кризис терминологии, где мы должны определиться не только для Швейцарии, которая является эталоном, да, сегодня, но и для тех других стран, которые являются переходной экономикой. Где здесь общество? Является ли, например, количество общественных организаций достаточное, уровнем цивилизованности общества, и показывает ли эта степень осознания общества достаточной для того, чтобы решать проблемы, и ставить их и решать? Вот, пожалуйста.
Thank you for that contribution. I'll go back to you, and then I'll come to you.
My name is Rupakumar Kohli from World Meteorological Organization. I refer to a comment by one of the panel members on the research or the studies done on the impacts of climate change Actually, if we want to look at the impacts, the problem that the researchers face is the lack of adequate data, particularly which describes the socio-economic aspects. While we have excellent data sets that describe the climate as a physical system, we don't have a handle on the socio-economic aspects, which actually inhibits a proper study of the impacts. I think we need to highlight the importance of collecting and archiving and disseminating information on the socio-economic aspects, particularly which are sensitive to climate variability and change.
All right, thank you. There was a question here.
Hello, my name is Shabaldin Alexander. I'm from a private company developing biofuel generation in Russia. The question is, as I understood, mostly you think that government is responsible for minimizing that risks, not business. But in my view, business is more effective in general, and only business can, solve all this problem with climate change, with ecology. And I wonder, what do you think are the particular measures which business must done to, to minimize these problems? Thank you.
All right, I'm just going to see, because there's 3 panel members also wanted to contribute. Can I note this question for you, Mr. Kivisari? Okay. So Mr. Kivisari will respond to your question.
Hi, I'm from India, from Joyashree Roy from Jadavpur University. I was listening to the whole discussion, but let me be a little provocative, because what I was just thinking is that I would be hearing some comments from the private sector or for the government sector that what is the transformational change they are really looking at, or what is the step that can really bring in transformational change. Whatever we heard is just the business as usual. So if we want to do something business unusual, I really did not hear anything from the podium. What is the business unusual the private sector is looking for? What is the business unusual the government sector is looking for? I don't think I have really heard it. It's just the business as usual.
Would you like to share a perspective of what the business unusual could be? We'll come to that. We'll come to that.
Thank you very much. My name is Ben Slay. I work for the United Nations Development Program, and I would like to raise a broader question about the extent to which we really can manage risk related to climate change. The idea of risk management really makes a lot of sense when the risks that we want to manage have very well-defined probabilities. So you can insure against the risk of a fire in a neighborhood when statistically you know on average how many fires occur in the neighborhood and on average the value of the real estate in the neighborhood. Then it's a very straightforward proposition. But the further we get away from that type of situation, the more difficult it is to manage risk. And the best example of this were all of the financial risk management products that Wall Street had invented that apparently worked so well to insure itself against risk that the entire apparatus became so complicated that it could neither be regulated by the government or even the companies themselves didn't understand exactly how those risk instruments worked, with the financial crisis of 2008 being the result. Climate risks are, it seems to me, much more difficult to statistically quantify than other kinds of risks. Maybe even more so than the kinds of financial risks that got us into the financial crisis of 2008. Why do we believe that we can develop instruments that will effectively help us to manage the risks and not maybe magnify them from the communities or the sectors where the risks might occur and transfer them more broadly throughout the financial system and society as a whole? Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. I'll come back to you. I'll just give the panel an opportunity to respond. I'll start with Mr. Kivisari to address this question and the question just before, the business unusual. And then we'll move to Mary. You wanted to? Okay. All right.
Well, for the insurers, I think all of our business is business unusual, because we want them to be unusual, these disasters. This is a bit a reaction to Mr. Fust, but also the other issues of risk management. As the last question pointed out, the financial sector might not be the role model for risk management, but at least you have, during the financial crisis, you have learned many lessons, like what you said about certain instruments in the financial sectors. I think a bell should have rang among those who were in AIG warehousing certain products and thinking they get a risk-free return of that. So the bell should have rang that now there is something wrong in our systems, and the problem is that it didn't ring. Generally, the idea Mr. Fust was talking about, the national risk officer. The question before this was what the private sector can bring in here. I have maybe two issues here. One is really, it was very much manifested with the financial crisis, but certainly it's an issue of climate change also. We have very complex systems. We have huge networks interfering with each other, and that is certainly something that at least in the financial sector we are starting to get grips of understanding these networks within us. But I think generally we might have something to give in this area, but generally much more research would be needed in the area of understanding highly networked risks in all kinds of systems. And that might be the current problem of getting ahead. Then another issue here is that with climate, with other issues, we very often talk about catastrophes. And that's because when there is a catastrophe, it hits the news. It's on the front pages of newspapers, and you react only to these catastrophes. But then on the other hand, we have things that happen slowly behind the scene. You don't really notice it, and I think in its area, insurance is certainly good in analyzing with its statistics what is happening slowly. With climate, many things are happening slowly, and you only realize them when you look at the statistics. So collecting statistics would be a good part from insurers in their part, but other areas also, to generate good knowledge in understanding what needs to be done. And when I say this is business unusual, I hope it to be unusual. For us in insurance industry, we don't like to have these disasters or whatever. So for insurers also, an avoided loss is always better than a compensated loss, because we can only pay money, and you cannot compensate a death really with money. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. Perhaps very quickly, because there was also the question of the gentleman there asking about the role of the private sector in risk management, and it seemed to be that from the panel there, the perception was that the public sector should play a larger role in that than the private sector, and he was asking that. I mean, I'm paraphrasing your question. I hope I got that right.
Thank you. I mean, it's a matter who can do it better. It's as simple as that. And there needs to be a consensus. Of course, the private sector can deliver technically or so much and many things more than the government can do. But the issue is who is doing what, and who is playing what role, and who is paying for what. And that is why you probably have different schemes in different countries. I also agree that we have a lack of social data, that is for sure. But to the lady, I mean, transformation change, to manage a crisis is easier to manage the normal. I'm sorry to say that. And I was for 18 years in disaster relief and disaster reaction and reduction. But it's much easier to manage a crisis than to manage the normal. And to manage the normal means that you have to put into questions in a permanent manner and to adapt and to change, and not only ask or wait until you have big catastrophes or changes. Governance of public affairs means also to respond to people. And I think in India, for example, I attended a meeting who is influencing the behavior of people towards adaptation for climate change. And the conclusion was, it is not BBC, it's not CNN, it's not the national government, it's the local community, by creating a local concern for the community member. And then they will adapt and will change. So maybe we also have to learn from local communities how they do it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Water Policy Division, Rushydra, Elena Bizina. I would like to make a point about the research that nowadays many private companies are running their own research on climate change and adaptations. For example, EDF, Coppel, and many hydroenergetic companies. But the problem is that many of them are not published as broadly and widely as academic ones. And so we need much more coordination in compiling all these results from this research into maybe several like world centers, in 3 or 5 world centers, to make a picture of what is going on, because their share of private research is growing up, but they are closed for publication in many cases. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, just a couple of points I'd like to make. I mean, I think sometimes we tend to overcomplicate things. You know, there are examples from all over the world where simple solutions, simple common sense solutions would go a long way in you know, changing and creating the conditions and incentives for the kind of transformative change that we like to see. A good example is, you know, many parts of Africa, especially in Eastern Africa, where, you know, it's no longer possible to grow certain types of crops, like the maize crop. And, you know, this will entail the kinds of transformations you're talking about. Because if you go and tell a farmer in Mwingi district he cannot grow maize, he will probably kick you out of the district. But there are also incentives in place, like government policies, such as, you know, subsidies on the maize seed or maize crop, or market systems or whatever geared towards a maize crop, that makes it very attractive for a farmer to keep doing what he's doing. Meanwhile, there's nothing in the system to, you know, incentivize the growing of sorghums or millets, which work better in those climates. In Sri Lanka, my own country, we have an issue where the renewable industry is hampered by a continued policy by the government to pay the Ceylon Electricity Board, which manages electricity, you know, the funding that needs to pay for the electricity. So with government guarantees to continuously pay the bill, there's no space for the private sector to come in and provide something that may be more efficient and probably cheaper and more effective in the context of what we're asking for. So, you know, these are not complicated things. You know, put a bunch of experts far more knowledgeable than I am in a room and they'll come up with hundreds of these. That's what's lacking, and I think that's what we need to do instead of overthinking this, because it's a simple solutions that will get us furthest in the short term.
I'll follow up with a question in a minute, but I wanted to give Mary also the opportunity to speak.
I guess in response to this question raised, and I agreed, across many sectors, industry is actually conducting its own research, both into the impact of its own activities, but in relation to the climate change agenda, but also looking at the impact of climate change, on their whole value chain. I think perhaps we still need to strengthen the dialogue between the research sector, the policy sector, and the private sector. And there are many mechanisms out there. We can do this by building on existing mechanisms. I'm glad to see that we have here the representative of the Russian industrialists and entrepreneurs. Many sectors have both regional, international, and national representative bodies that, the research industry and policymakers can actually utilize in order to dialogue with the sector as a whole. We have the oil and gas industry representative union. We have the transport sector, aviation sector. So we have pathways there, and I don't really believe that we're actually utilizing those as yet. And so I think we need to really, the way we have in the discussion on disaster risk management and national platforms that bring together the community, private sector, and government, I think we have to utilize a similar model in relation to climate risk management and adaptation policies that look at both, regional, national, and subnational to local government level. So again, it's not rocket science. I don't think we have to invent a whole new governance structure, but the governance issue is quite critical, and the whole issue of exchange of information, exchange of research, and translation of research into useful information, I think, hinges around institutionalizing this dialogue a bit further. Thank you.
All right, thank you. If there are other questions, please raise your hand. If not, then I'll have a question. Also from the previous days, I mean, I understood. I mean, there's a big question around, how to utilize the little public funding there is in order to really incentivize private sector to do a lot of investments. I also wanted to pose that question to the audience and to the group here. So on what are ways that we can do that? I mean, we already started to talk about a little bit. And perhaps this is the incentive to create that business unusual. Without creating a crisis, you still have incentives for the private sector to make those investments. You, okay. I was counting.
I again just make a comment, and so it can again generate very good discussion. I was really happy to get the responses in the previous discussion. What I feel is that I think we are missing out that we as a whole, doesn't matter whether it is civil society, public sector, or private sector, we as humanity is in a crisis. So it's the responsibility of all. So if there is any, so it's a general externality that we have created, and that cost needs to be borne by all of us. So consumers are thinking they are not going to pay anything extra if there is going to be something, some new actions to be taken, which is resilient to the climate change. And private sector is thinking that let me be risk-averse, and I'm not going to pay anything extra, and so it needs to be all taken care of by someone else. And government is thinking, let me see what others are bringing in the table, and then we will act. I think we all are making mistake. We all have to bear the cost, and that cost is not in terms of, losing the benefit. It's for strengthening the benefit. So I think there is a need for reformulating or communicating the messages in a different way when we are in the climate change related action plans or policies. And I agree that there is not rocket science, but you see, we all were very much attentive when there was geoengineering solution was talked about. But at a much lesser cost, we can avoid 50% of the risks, but we are not talking about those, because this doesn't have any technology per se attached to this. So I think we have to change our mindset too.
All right, last two questions, and then we'll move on to wrap up.
Thanks. I'll see if I can formulate this in the way of question. Ian Trim from the British Embassy. We talked an awful lot about communicating the risks to businesses and getting businesses to adapt to the risks of climate change that are there. But it's business that is very good at communicating things to other businesses. So perhaps one way to look at it is to flip it over and get businesses to see the opportunities that are there. Clearly, when we're talking about sort of tens, hundreds of billions of pounds of financing that's needed for mitigation efforts, that's a huge market that's there. Now, it's in insurance, for example, it's not government that tells people they need insurance and then they buy insurance. It's insurance companies that sell insurance to other companies, to other people, to mitigate against those risks. So perhaps if we create the market, we demonstrate to these organizations that there is this huge pot of money out there, potential for people to need to mitigate, it will come from business to sell the opportunity that's there. Not sure where the question is there, but...
Yes, in my case, it's not a question either. It's actually a reaction to the last comment from the lady that was actually triggering a conversation in terms of the extra cost related to adaptation, climate change, and risk reduction. And I think in this regards, we do need to communicate better what it means disaster risk reduction, but also what it means investing in disaster risk reduction. Because by doing so, we will really realize that if we properly invest in risk reduction, we are not going to discuss extra costs. In fact, we are saving money. We are saving money in response.
All right. I'm going to turn to the panel for closing remarks, or if there's any final reactions.
Ну, я хотел бы сказать, что вот мы в этой дискуссии прекрасно, по-моему, иллюстрируем стремление переложить проблему друг на дружку. Значит, бизнес говорит, нет, это задача государства, государство говорит, нет, это задача бизнеса. Кто может более эффективнее сделать? Мне кажется, у нас главная проблема в непонимании цены риска. Коллега вот из Индии, по-моему, упомянул об этом. У нас, у русских людей, есть такая поговорка. Вот если вы не можете решить проблему, я создам вам условия, при которых к вечеру вас поставят двоих и расстреляют. Вот если не найдете решение, так оно и будет. И оно находится, как правило, потому что никто не хочет быть расстрелянным. А вот проблема климата, изменения климата, это, мне кажется, вот то самое экологическое последствие человеческой деятельности. Во многом доказано, что это так. И мы не очень понимаем, как посыпется посуда в той самой посудной лавке, где человек ведет себя как слон. Да? Знаете, такая пословица, ведешь себя как слон в посудной лавке. То есть делаешь все движения, которые угрожают посыпаться всему. Вот мы экологические проблемы, все время их решение как бы откладываем. Думаем, что на нашем веку они не произойдут. И вдруг появляется понимание того, что уже все происходит. Вот, нечто началось. И все равно как бы не хватает мужества, сил, денег, мозгов, мыслей. Как же договориться-то? Как нам всем вместе начать действительно от политиков до конкретных бизнесменов пытаться сделать все от тебя зависящее, чтобы не влиять на климат, чтобы он не изменялся так быстро? Наверное, все, конечно, в сознании, все, так сказать, в образовании, в коммуникациях, в взаимодействии друг с дружкой, но все-таки мне кажется, что направление, именно в этом направлении идет движение. И в этом, наверное, наша единственная надежда, что мы успеем. А может быть и нет.
All right, thank you, Mark. I have very little to add to that. Any final comments? No? There's one more question, but I think we have to take that message or that question in the break in order to stay on time.
Well, thank you. That comes or brings us to the timely conclusion of the panel. Obviously, global risks are not confined to national borders, and they cannot be managed through the actions of a single sector. That is why a governance of global systemic risks requires cohesion between countries and have to include all the sectors concerned. I think it was pretty obvious that nor the private sector, nor the government, nor research alone can bring the solutions, that there must be a formula to work closely together. We also heard clearly that there is a need for evidence, there is a need for data. And obviously we also heard that the public perception or the perception of different people from different sectors might differ. We have heard we need a change of mindset. I'm critical towards that. I would say we need an enlargement of our mindset, because obviously you cannot change people, but you can change their behavior pattern, their way of thinking. And then, of course, we have seen that the issue of financing, who is doing what public finances are spent for. When we see how much money was spent to, let's say, save the banks 2 years ago and what is mobilized now, we need a small percentage of that to finance adaptation to climate change for the next 10 to 15 years. Sorry to say that. So that means there is not only a need to do it, there is opportunity, and I'm quite confident that there is also the financial means to do it if there is a political will. And whether there is a political will at the end depends on the private sector and the society at large. We have failed so far to communicate that there is a good life also with a lower carbon emission society, that there is mobility also with lower carbon. And finally, we have also to conclude a very substantial part of adaptation is mitigation, is reducing emissions. So thank you for your attention. Thank you, the moderator, for having managed us. Thank you, all the participants. And thank you, Yuri, for giving us guidance. So the last word is to the host representative, please.
Да, спасибо всем, кто участвовал в этом мероприятии. Я думаю, вам было интересно, как и нам. Поскольку эта проблема, в общем-то, в России, она, честно говоря, начинает обсуждаться так широко и активно. И пока не можем мы с коллегой похвастаться, что мы этим как бы очень сильно озабочены. В основном по тем причинам, о которых я как бы упомянул в своей реплике. Но все-таки вот это желание взаимодействовать и желание найти решение этой проблемы, оно, наверное, победит. И мы как бы вместе начнем вырабатывать некие решения, понимая, что начинать нужно с себя. Как бы каждая страна должна сама предложить способы решения и прислушаться или присоединиться к тем мировым тенденциям, которые сегодня в этой проблеме существуют. Ну, я пожелаю всем удачи в их поприще, конкретном деле. Ну и у кого и будет возможность все-таки посмотреть Москву в эти напряженные дни работы конференции. И успехов на будущее. Спасибо.